Welcome to The Pursuit, a podcast produced by the Junior Board of the Chicago Midwest chapter of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, otherwise known as NATAS. We are a group of emerging media professionals seeking insight from leaders in our fields. I'm Carmen Vincent, a video producer, editor, and documentary filmmaker from Northwest Indiana, and I'm your host for this episode. I had the honor of speaking with trailblazer Thea Flaum about her 35-year career as an Emmy Award-winning producer and her most recent journey as founder and president of the Hill Foundation, which runs Facing Disability, a website that connects families dealing with spinal cord injuries with the life experiences of others, providing medical information and resources. It's no secret that Thea is one of the most accomplished producers in Chicago and in the TV industry at large, not to mention a former NATAS board member and Silver Circle Honoree. I can't wait for you to learn from her stories and words of wisdom, so let's jump right in. Well, Thea, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today to talk about your producing and disability advocacy, just a career full of accolades and awards and fantastic work that I really admire, and I know so many people will respond to your journey and your story and learn a lot from you. So thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Carmen. I'm happy to be part of this.
Absolutely. Great. You know, in the name of The Pursuit, when was that moment when you first knew you wanted to pursue this career?
That's an interesting and a good place to start. The very first TV show I did was a documentary about the delay in bringing criminal cases actually to trial. And I was doing some work for the Urban Research Corporation, which was a company in the 80s, we talk this way, whose job was to tell the rich about the poor. And so it was a time of great social unrest, all kinds of things. And I had decided and I had written some film strips for Encyclopedia Britannica, and I decided that I wanted to go into television. So I called the only person I knew in television. I had appeared on a TV show of hers, and asked her to come to lunch with me and said to her that I would like to be a TV producer. And I've always been grateful that she didn't say to me, yes, you and every third person walking down the street, what makes you think you can do it? And she didn't. She said, well, I'm working on a show about the criminal courts. Would you like to work on that? And I said, sure, I would be thrilled to work on it. And although I had been being paid as a writer, I said I would write it for no pay, as long as I could be involved every step of the way. And on the very first day of the very first shoot, as we started shooting, I knew that I had found the thing in life that I was born to do. And there was no question from that very first day. And I think that when you find the thing that you were born to do, you are likely pretty good at it. And that in some sense, you already know how to do it. I'd never produced a television show before, obviously, but yet somehow I knew how to do it. I knew how to relate to the camera. I knew all kinds of other things instinctively, I guess. And that's how it all began. And that first show actually won a local Chicago Emmy, and it went on from there.
And off to the races. I think that's such an encouraging message for people still trying to figure out exactly what their thing is. They know they're creative, but they haven't had that aha moment. And like you're saying, just to trust yourself, because you'll recognize it when you get there.
I think that's true. I think you will.
Fantastic.
And maybe for some people, they never get there. And if they don't, perhaps that's a sign too. The business today is very, very tough, even tougher than it was when I started, and it was plenty tough then.
Yes.
So if you want to do this, and sort of the universe is telling you that, listen, this is just not working out, maybe you should listen to the universe after a while. You give it a try, you work hard at it, you do your best. And then I always say, this is probably something not to have at the beginning of the podcast, but I always say to people that in order to succeed in this business, in addition to being talented and hardworking and smart and skilled and learned in the profession, you also need to be a little lucky. And that's not fair. That's just not fair. But that's the way it is. And so it's a crazy business where really, in addition, you have to have everything going for you and run into a bit of good luck. So I'm happy to pass on my experience and knowing in that instant that I'd found the right thing. And if it happens, I guess the thing to do is to stick with it. And if it doesn't, maybe think of something else you'd like to do.
Absolutely. I totally resonate with what you're saying, that there is an element of luck in being successful in the film and TV industry, and that's just the way it is. What do you say to people who don't seem to be coming up against that luck? Is it something to pivot from, or just to keep trying?
That's a very good question. If you're in the business that I was in, everyone wants to come to you and talk to you and send their children to you and their cousins and their nieces and their nephews and everyone to talk about getting into television. And what I used to say was, which is not really an answer to the question that you're asking, if there's something else that you think that you really would love to do, perhaps it makes sense to go do that because of the element of luck that you just have to run into in order to succeed. And as far as how long it makes sense to pursue it, I think that has to come out of somebody's own heart. I really do. And it's not a matter of becoming discouraged. Listen, everybody becomes discouraged at some point. But it's a matter of realistically assessing, okay, how much more time, how much more effort, how much more heart do I want to put into this? Or should I start looking around for something that will also give me satisfaction, that will make me happy, that will enable me to earn a living, that will enable me to make a contribution to the world? Because maybe this isn't going to happen for me.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's such valuable advice. And also, I wonder how you would respond to someone who makes that pivot, but then feels like they were a failure in pursuing.
Oh, no, I really don't think that anybody who makes a serious try at getting into this business can ever consider themselves a failure if it doesn't work out. Mm-hmm. I mean, it takes incredible bravery to even try. I mean, after all, what are you putting out there? You're putting out your own creative product that comes out of your own head, out of your own heart, out of the person that you are, the person that you've grown up to be. You've got to be proud of doing that. And if it doesn't work out, well, it doesn't work out. We all have love affairs that don't work out. So maybe it just doesn't work out, but never feel like a failure. You're not a failure. I will tell you a failure story. I haven't thought of this in years.
Yes, please.
So I created, along with Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, a movie review show that ultimately became the most popular half-hour show on public television.
Yes. Sneak previews. We got to give that a shout out.
Right. And so when we started, we were, after all, two film critics from Chicago. Chicago, really? Not LA, not New York. The fact that Roger Ebert had already won a Pulitzer Prize and was the only movie critic for, I think, 23 years ever to win a Pulitzer. That didn't matter. We were just people from Chicago. What did we know? And there was a review of the show, which had run on the public television station in New York, in the Village Voice. Now, the Village Voice was a very avant-garde kind of nose-in-the-air publication. And the last line in the review was, "Sneak previews is just noise." I know. Awful.
Why were they wrong?
Well, but at that point, nobody knew. I mean, we were just starting out. It was the first time, that it was being carried nationally, although we've been doing it for 2 years before then. But the point is that if you ever want to be discouraged, somebody tell you it's a failure. I mean, here we had thrown ourselves into it, heart and soul, Gene and Roger and I and the scenic designer and the director and the whole staff and everybody. And they're saying this work product of ours is just noise. I never met the critic who wrote that over all the years. And I'm happy to say that he was wrong. And the world proved that he was wrong. But can you imagine how it would feel to get a review like that?
Oh my goodness, no. I mean, what kept you going after that?
Oh, well, I didn't care.
Okay, good. Okay.
I didn't care. I knew how good it was. I mean, it was already proving itself from the very beginning. There's a thing that you can feel when you're doing something that's good. I would often say to the people who worked for me, both in public television and when I had my own television production company, that if you do something that is good, it is almost universally recognized as good. Sometimes bad is mistaken for good, but if you do something that's really good, it's almost universally recognized. People just feel it, that it's good. In this one case, that didn't happen to be the case, but I think that, as a matter of fact, it didn't bother me. I was just kind of horrified. I mean, of all of the nasty things, it's like, oh no. You know?
Right. Well, I mean, it's inspiring to hear that you stuck to your beliefs and your intuitions and just kept going with it. And that.
Well, and remember too, Carmen, we were getting a lot of feedback. The public television stations loved it. The audience kept growing and growing. We had a huge response coming to us from all over the country. Gene and Roger were getting recognized in airports. Roger once called me from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he said to me, "You won't believe this. Somebody just recognized me here in the Albuquerque airport." And I said, well, good.
Wow.
So there were all kinds of signs coming back that the show was a success, that people liked it, that people were watching it. We had ratings that let us know that. And so if this one guy thought it was just noise, well, too bad.
Yes. I think a lot of people would get distracted by the one critic and not listen to all of the great other feedback they're getting. So commend you for listening to that. And I just have to say, thank you for doing that, because I grew up watching sneak previews with my father, and that's how we connected. So it's a wonderful memory for me. So thank you. And I truly believe you're a huge contributor to why film is such a big industry in Chicago now.
Yeah, I think I used to say no. But, now I think looking back, and there's been, interestingly, so much interest lately in the show and its history. I think because so many people who are now doing podcasts and in the business and have decided that it was an important part of their cultural use. And so they want to find out more about it anyway. So yes, I think in the end, I used to say, it's just television. But in the end, I think it did make a contribution.
Absolutely.
Maybe still is. I don't know.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. I want to backtrack a little bit and just establish the role of a producer, because I get asked this so many times, like, what does a producer do? What do you do? So how do you describe the role of a producer?
The way I used to explain it is that in the movies, the director is the creative head of the movie. The director casts the actors, hires the scenic designer, and the person who designs the costumes works with the writer. The director is the creative head, and the producer is the financial head. In television, because of the history of television and the way it grew up, do you really want to know this?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
So in television, the producer is both the creative head and the financial head, responsible for both. And the reason for this is that in the early days of television, it was only live, and it all came produced live from a studio. Okay. So a producer's job was to get the show completely ready. A director sat in the control room, and the producer would bring the show into the studio ready to go and work with the director while the director block the cameras and put it on the air. Mm-hmm. So the history of television is that producers are really both the creative and the financial head of the whole project, of any television project. Absolutely. So that's the difference. And so it means you're in charge of everything. And if you're an executive producer, you're in charge of everything. So that's what it is.
I guess along that line, when you got started producing, how long did it take for you to feel like you've developed the skills to be confident and call yourself a producer?
Well, I mean, if they give you the title, you call yourself a producer right away. But that's a good question. I was very fortunate to work. The first series I did was a series that ended up on PBS for parents about parenting. And it was called Look at Me. And it was how to help your child grow up smarter and happier. Mm-hmm. And I worked with a director whose name was Bill Heitz, who is a wonderfully experienced director, years and years at NBC. And he really understood what I was trying to do. He admired the writing that I did. And he taught me a great deal, really a great deal. And because he respected me, if I had an opinion about, and I thought maybe something should go some way, he would consider it seriously and try to do it. I mean, as though I really knew what I was doing. He believed in me, was, I guess, the bottom line. And we did a number of projects together, all of them successful. He was absolutely great. I really, in many ways, owe him, among other people. But maybe at the top of the list, I owe him my career. He passed away a number of years ago. He's absolutely extraordinary. He was great. So that helped me gain confidence because I was working right next to this tremendous pro who thought I knew what I was doing and also thought what I was doing was right, and it succeeded. If you succeed, nothing succeeds like success. You know that.
Absolutely. And maybe that's where luck did play a role in your career, where you did get, like, you were put next to Bill and he got to mentor you in that way.
Yeah. It was there were a number of things that happened to me that were looking back on it, very lucky. Among them, the time when I started. I started at WTTW and I started as a producer of that criminal courts show that I told you about as a freelance, as I said, for no pay. And then when I was put on the staff right after, it was the sort of thing where if you could come up with an idea and they liked it, you could just do it. They would allot you the facilities, cameramen and whatever all else you needed, editing time. You had to negotiate for all that stuff. But in the end, if they gave a project the go-ahead, you could do it. And most of the stuff that you did not have a big out-of-pocket budget. Those came much later. But early in my career, if you could come up with a good creative idea of something you wanted to do, they would say, okay, do it. So that meant that you could explore. For example, I got an idea. I found from research that women were watching soap operas in the afternoon and that manufacturers would look at the furniture, the colors, the clothes people were wearing, the hairdos, the makeup, everything to plan their lines for the next season because whatever people saw on television in the soap operas, that's what they would want in the stores. And I came up with an idea for a show that I think I just fell in love with the title. Here was the title. Some of My Best Friends Are Soap Operas. Nice, right? Good title. Because there are people, they would watch them every day, religiously, stop everything. And so I said to management, I'm going to do that show about soap operas. I need to have a TV set in my office so I can watch the soap operas because I never could really watch them. Mm-hmm. So they put a television set. In those days, it wasn't like it is now. They had to run wires and actually put a TV set in my office. And I would try to watch. And I thought it was also boring and stupid that I couldn't. And, everybody had gone to a lot of trouble for this. So it was sort of embarrassing. And I kept trying and trying and trying. And they would say, so what's happening with the soap opera show? I'd say, well, I'm still thinking, and finally I never did it. Because really, if you're not yourself interested in a project, if you can't relate to it, how do you expect to create something that viewers are going to relate to? So if I couldn't relate to it, I knew I couldn't create a show that people were going to relate to. So I never did it. Yeah. But it was that kind of time. And nobody ever said to me, so whatever happened? So until the day I left Channel 11, I had a TV set in my office. They never.
Wow. Yeah. I'm sure people are listening to this and wondering how to get started. And I know you probably get this question a million times a day, but knowing that, it's probably better for a producer to produce on a show for a story that they do feel passionate about, like you just said. But sometimes it doesn't feel like starting out, you have the power to pick and choose like that.
Well, you don't.
Yeah.
If you can find a job in any kind of production, take it. And then keep your eyes open for other things that you can do. Because now that the people know you and they know you're competent to do it, that you think might be good. For example, if you're working on a show with a lot of segments, can you come up with an original idea for a segment that they might like? Not an expensive one either. No. Mm-hmm. So that you have a chance to create some things of your own. And ultimately, if you keep working at it, I just don't know about today. There are so many stories. The guy who does dirty jobs, he has that wonderful voice. That's mainly what he was a voice. And he was doing a show. He was working for, I think it was Good Evening San Francisco or San Francisco Tonight, a local TV show. And he had come up with the idea to do dirty jobs. And, he's he's really big, tall, good-looking guy. He was the host of a TV special I was doing, which is how I learned all about this. And he thought it would make a show. And he went to whoever it is who runs it. I think it's National Geographic or whoever, and sold them on the show based on the fact that he had done these segments. And for some reason, Westinghouse, which owned the show that he was on in San Francisco, made a deal with him and let him take those because he really had created them and make them into, his own show. And the rest, as we know, has turned out to be extremely successful. All the stories are kind of unique. They involve being on the lookout for an opportunity. And if you're a creative person, you can probably find an opportunity somewhere. And selling it and doing it successfully, and then saying, hey, I did this. How about letting me do that? You just have to work your way through. I think it's very hard. It's about proving you have the talent to deliver.
Right.
And so if you have to make something that proves you have the talent, and it's hard to do. I always used to say to people when they would say, well, maybe I should make a pilot. I have this great idea for a show. Here is what I would say. Never, 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 never use your own money to make a pilot. Never. Or your friends or your Uncle Fred's. Do not do it. If you have a great idea, people who buy these shows, the development officers at networks, don't go looking at pilots that somebody made themselves almost ever. They kind of have their own ideas. You have to pitch them the idea. If they like it, they'll pay you and pay the costs of making the pilot. So I think, taking and sinking a whole bunch of money into something just because you believe it and believe in it is a very risky thing to do. On the other hand, that's what the Coen brothers did when they started, got money from their family, and look where they are now. So it isn't necessarily 100% true. But as a way in, it's probably the most risky that I can think of.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd imagine a lot of people listening to this might be drawn to producing, hearing you talk about it, especially that there's a creative component to TV producing, that it's not just logistics and budgets and stuff like that. A natural next step is to try to, get your first experience on set, but also to find a fantastic mentor. That being said, do you have any advice for folks looking for mentors, and how should they go about finding them? And then what's a good mentor-mentee relationship look like?
I think the most important thing is to come up with real creative ideas. If you have good ideas, the mentor relationship will happen almost inevitably. After all, producers don't think that they have all the ideas themselves. They recognize a good idea in an eager person, and your success, if you're the person that comes with them with the idea, your success is the producer's success. And then it goes on from there. I think it's probably really important to try to choose a person of good character as your mentor. This can be a very ugly business, not so much in Chicago, certainly in Los Angeles. There are very few goodies to go around, even though it's a big industry and getting bigger, which is good. And there are way more people who are going after those goodies. And people who would never dream of the kinds of really ugly behavior back in their hometown of Sioux Falls. They would never do it. They find themselves doing it, mostly because I think they're frightened. So I think it's good to try to attach yourself to someone who's a person of good character and who will not use and abuse you, who gives you credit for your ideas. When you hear someone say, hey, that was a great bit that you did, and they don't say, yeah, it was Carmen's idea, that would give you pause. So if the way to find a good mentor is to find a good person.
Hey there, you're listening to The Pursuit, the podcast series produced by the Junior Board of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, Chicago Midwest Chapter. My name's John Owens. I'm the president of NATAS Chicago Midwest. We'll get back to this great interview in just a moment. But first, I just wanted to make sure everyone keeps an eye on the NATAS Chicago Midwest website, and we'll have information about the upcoming 63rd Annual Chicago Midwest Emmy Awards. This will take place later in the fall, and we'll also have more information on some of our workshops and special events that we have planned for this season. Our website is at chicagoemmyonline.org. So be on the lookout for some of the great events we have planned for this season. Now, back to the pursuit.
You have all these wonderful stories about your career, and I wonder if it might help folks to hear about, what are some of the challenges you faced being a producer in Chicago? And are you willing to share any of those and how you overcame them?
Sure. I was fortunate in that when I started in television, it was possible to create a public television show in Chicago and have it run nationwide. And because I had some real, no kidding success, not only with sneak previews, but I also was the executive producer of a show called Soundstage. It was easy to get into the people who bought programs at the networks and to get an audience with the development people to listen to your ideas so you could pitch your ideas. I don't know what it's like to try to get in to see them, although there are so many more outlets and there are so many more development people around, it may not be that difficult. And if you come up with an idea that is not LA or New York based, you can travel and do a show anywhere. And so I did a lot of traveling when I had to for the shows I was making. And in the early days of HGTV, in fact, before it even started, there was a man whose name was Ed Spray. And Ed had been the news director of WBBM TV in Chicago, Channel 2. And he and I knew each other because we were both members of the NATAS board in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And because he and I would give, he called it the Ed and Thea, our dog and pony show, we would sometimes go and give speeches, and he would talk about how to do TV news, and I would talk about how to do TV production. So Ed finally left the business and went to teach television at Syracuse University. And one day I got a phone call. It was Ed. Hi, Ed. How are you? He said, well, I'm fine. You'll never believe what I'm doing. I said, you're in Syracuse. Aren't you teaching? He said, well, I was. I said, you just got there. He said, I know. But they've come to me with an idea of starting a new television network. It will be called HGTV, Home and Garden Television. I said, what? He said, yeah. And I am just calling a few producers whose work I really respect to ask them to do shows for us. Would you be interested? And at that point, I had my own television production company. And even if I hadn't, Ed was a great guy. It sounded interesting. I'd done some shows for HBO and for Showtime. And I said, sure, absolutely. So that was it. And actually, when HGTV went on the air for the first time, the show that I think kicked off primetime, but it was definitely in primetime, was one of my shows, which was called At the Auction, which was a show about selling things at auction. And so I made hundreds of shows for HGTV and for, there was a show we did called From Junkie to Funky. There was a show called The Shopping Detective. There was a show called Cityscapes about gardens. There was a show called The Appraisal Fair. When I tell you hundreds of episodes, I am not exaggerating. And so that was lucky. I mean, it was the beginning of that kind of cable. Now it's, selling shows, it's a different world. I always followed the rule that if I wanted to sell a show, I went in with only one show to sell. Maybe a backup, because there's the thing that development executives do and say, well, what else you got? What else? You got to go in with the one that you feel strongly about and keep pitching until you see the light in their eyes or until you see that it's not going to be there. And then you stop, But I never went in there with a laundry list of shows or a laundry list of ideas. I found one that I thought they could buy into and tried to sell that one. And, sometimes they bought, sometimes they didn't. I used to believe that if you wait long enough, you finally get to make every show you ever wanted to make. It's not really true. But I did get to make a lot of the shows that I wanted to make, and that was good. And partly that was luck.
If people listening
for some reason haven't noticed yet, you are a legend and they've noticed now. I mean, that story is incredible. To be part of that movement and trailblaze the way for a network like HGTV, but also all of the shows you pitched. I mean, and pitched and produced. Like, you've had so much success in your career. And I wonder, how does that sit with you? How do you define success in your career and in your life?
In my career, the only person I have ever tried to please, ever, with the shows that I've made, is myself. And I don't care how much you tell me this was great and that was great and this was, I need to feel that this show represents the best that I can do and that I've given it my best shot. And so I work to please myself. And if I'm pleased myself with the show, even if someone says it's just noise, I don't care, because I know it isn't. I know that it's really good and strong. I don't know. Part of being successful is, I think, it's really in other people's eyes. In your own eyes, if you can feel confident about what you did. I never made a show that I was ashamed of. Once you're successful, so then other people want to hire you, partly because they say, well, we hired Thea Flaum. And so if it didn't work out, we hired her, so on and so forth. Oh, here's a story. Okay. So somebody came to me and wanted me to do some kind of small thing for, I think it was WGN, about the lottery, that it would go on every day. And it was really, it would be a simple thing you could kind of churn out. And I agonized over it because I really believed then, and I still do, that the lottery is a device for extracting money from poor people. Rich people don't play the lottery, or if they do it rarely. Really, it was like a tax on the poor. And I just felt like I shouldn't do it. And I agonized about it a whole weekend. And then they called me on Monday and told me, never mind, someone else was going to do the show. They never even offered it to me.
Wow.
So, well, I mean,
do you know what decision you would have made?
I wouldn't have done it.
Okay.
I wouldn't have done it. I never did a show that I was unhappy with.
I mean, that's a testament to sticking to your values.
And when I say that, I don't mean that I didn't. I did a show called for Orion Television, a big, expensive pilot that I flew to New York every week for 8 weeks to executive produce. I mean, it was people who had just recently been fired from 60 Minutes. I mean, it was a really good production team, and it was about stories about crime. And it was called Crime Watch Tonight. And the person in charge of it, whose idea it was the man whose idea it was, who really created CNN for Ted Turner. And along with Ted Turner, Ted Turner had the network, but it was Reese Schoenfeld. Reese Schoenfeld was the guy. And he was convinced that I should be the executive producer. And I said, okay. I mean, it was flattering and it was a lot of money. It was good. And what it was all of these, not necessarily salacious, but a little bit crime stories. And after a while, those of us snobby people, used to work on 60 Minutes, we refer to it among ourselves as Slime Watch. So, anyway, and it was, the cost was so outrageous. We were flying some well-known investigative reporter to Italy to look into young girls being brought in on the promise that they were going to be models and having it not work out. But, that kind of story. And it was costing a fortune. And finally, Orion Pictures, which was a big motion picture company at the time and paying for this whole debacle, brought in their own accountant and installed him in an office to look over everything. Not that anybody was taking any money. And we worked out of an office in New York in Spanish Harlem. So you had to call Barrio Taxi whenever you wanted to go anywhere. You couldn't get a regular taxi. Anyway, so that was not a show about which I was particularly proud on the one hand. On the other hand, I was not ashamed. I never did a show where I said, when people have done this, take my name off this show.
That's great.
But Slime Watch was just a mess.
Yeah.
Anyway, and it never went anywhere, by the way. Never. So.
Right. Well, it sounds like you had that instinct that it wouldn't by calling it Slime Watch. I don't know.
No, it was all of us. And it was, it's the New York crew of producers. They're tough people.
Yeah.
And they, after a while, I mean, that wasn't how everybody started out, but after a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I could ask you a million more questions about producing, but I do want to make sure we leave some space to talk about facing disability.
Sure.
And can you talk to me about when that first entered your mind as something you'd like to do and just how you made that transition?
Well, what happened was I sold my television production business, and my husband and I decided that we would start a foundation for the families of people dealing with spinal cord injuries. His daughter, my oldest daughter, stepdaughter, had been in an accident, and she is a C5 quadriplegia, has C5 quadriplegia, which means she can't really move anything. You know, she can move her shoulders, but not her legs, and she doesn't feel anything. And Vicky she finished college, went to graduate school, married an able-bodied man, had our first grandchild, who's now in her 20s. But it was a very hard pull for the family. Here's why. When a spinal cord injury happens, it's always as the result of an accident, always as the result of a trauma, and almost always results in paralysis, which again, almost always is lifelong. We have yet to discover any way to cure it. And so it is a traumatic event, not only, of course, for the person who's injured, but also for the members of the family. One day you're leading one life, and the next day you're leading. And so we decided that we would create, my husband and I, an organization that would work with families of people who had spinal cord injuries to help them through the whole long voyage of living with a spinal cord injury. And then one day I was driving actually back, I think it was from Bill Heitz's wake. And I had the radio on in my car, and they were interviewing a woman who was talking about the breast cancer survivors network, where this is a long time. This is like 2000, I don't know, 6 or 7, maybe earlier. Anyway, talking to other women who had dealt with breast cancer. And I thought, what if you could do that with video? What if you interviewed people and asked them how they handle spinal cord injuries but kept the answers short and focused and put them on video? So I went to the head of what was then the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, Dr. Joanne Smith, who is someone I kind of knew because we were both members of the Chicago network, a women's group. And I said to her, what do you think of this idea? And she thought it was a really good idea. And I talked to some other people. And so we went ahead and did it. And that's how Facing Disability began. And spinal cord injuries are relatively rare. So it's a very isolating thing. Most people who are dealing with a spinal cord injury don't know anybody else who even uses a wheelchair, let alone is unable to move or feel their either arms or legs. People don't know. And so to create this whole, we now have nearly 3,000 videos on the website, a lot of them doctors. Well, we probably got like something like, I don't know, 1,700 people, short videos of people answering very specific questions about how they cope with spinal cord injury. People with spinal cord injuries themselves, their mothers, their fathers, their spouses, their partners, even their children. And because it's a small group of people, there are maybe 22,000 of them in the United States, all told. And most of those these days, it used to be 14,000, are because people are living longer and they're falling. But in any case, my point is that it's an isolating thing. And this is so that you can't easily find other people. And this is a chance, and it works. And because it's kind of a narrow field, we got to be pretty well known in the field rather quickly. And we've been very successful. So it's good.
Well, thank you so much for that work you do, because you're right. You've turned an isolating experience into just an experience that people can find community and comfort in.
I hope so. Yeah, this is important. So think of all the interviews I've probably done in my life, 1,000? If you want to get good answers, you have to focus the question, not what was your hospital stay like? What was difficult about the hospital? No. What was the hardest part of the first days in the hospital? Boom. You get a focused answer. And you ask that to a large number of people. And then you have a sort of array of experiences that other people can look at and say, I'll listen to this one. I'll listen to that one, So in its way, it is every bit as satisfying, although in a different way, as the really great. I had a wonderful career in television. I interviewed everyone from Paul McCartney, my idol, to Leon Letterman, who won 2 Nobel Prizes. I mean, it was great. I had a great career and I loved it, but I love doing what I'm doing now too.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're using those same skills that you cultivated for decades to add value. Yeah.
Absolutely true.
I want to leave space here at the end. I know this is not a point interview question, but in case you do have anything else, like any other advice you'd like to share with emerging producers and creatives.
Only that if you have strong faith in an idea of yours that you feel you can communicate to the world, and the world will be better for having. I always used to say that I wanted people who watched any of my shows to be different, a little tiny bit different than they were when they sat down to watch the show. In other words, we changed ever so slightly to have learned something new, to have thought about something new, to have laughed, to have cried maybe, to have been moved just a little bit. I think if you have something, an idea that you believe has the ability to communicate that way with people, that you should go forward and try to make it happen however you can. That would be my last word.
Thank you so much to Thea Flaum for coming on the podcast. It was an absolute honor and joy hearing about her career journey, and there's so much to take away from this episode. I really appreciate Thea's advice to trust your instincts when finding your passion, that if you're doing what you're meant to be doing, you'll know that in your heart. I also love that Thea is so transparent about the struggles and joys of working in the TV industry, and that not only do you need to be talented and hardworking to be successful, but you also need to be lucky. To me, that's a huge source of comfort for emerging producers and creatives who are working so hard to get to where they want to be, but haven't yet seen the results they envisioned. Finally, as Thea so wonderfully put, the most important thing is to come up with creative ideas that you believe in and connect with. What a meaningful call to action as we go back into the world as creatives. Please share this episode with any emerging producers, creatives, and TV lovers you know, and most importantly, keep creating. This has been The Pursuit, a NATAS Junior Board podcast.